Great. Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Yes, my name is Jason Anderson. I work at the University of Warwick. My background is in combination of things, teacher education, broadly understood, including developmental and training approaches. Colleagues here at IH London will know me from my work in initial pre-service teacher education as well, on things like cell to insert TESOL and my research in those areas. Today, I'm going to be talking about a topic which I've been researching more recently in relation both to my own PhD study and other work I've been doing around the world, which is looking at the question of teacher expertise. What is it? And when the topic for this conference came up, I thought it was an interesting perspective to add to it, particularly within the identities theme, because I think it is a very interesting question, one which we probably won't have so much time to discuss. There's a slide which I might use if we have time, but the question as to whether we as teachers are happy or whether we're comfortable with a term like expertise is an interesting one also to discuss. But we're going to do something slightly different for the talk. Those of you who saw my promo video will know one interesting thing that I'm interested in exploring in this talk. But before I do, let me just provide a rough kind of plan for the talk. We'll begin with a breakout discussion talking about issues to do with experience and expertise. I'll then provide a working definition of what I mean when I'm talking about teacher expertise in this talk. Then we'll look at several useful constructs that come from teacher expertise research that may help us to understand better the ways that teachers gain expertise or gain professional competence. And then we'll look at the evidence for a pathway to expertise. Does it exist? If so, what does it look like? There may be time, hopefully, for a second discussion in breakout rooms, looking at the question of what kind of professional development may lead towards expertise. And then I'll suggest, of course, as many of you will probably already know, rather I'll confirm that there are probably multiple developmental pathways towards expertise. And then we'll look at a little bit of further evidence from a meta-summary that I've recently completed on teacher expertise research. And hopefully, this is being optimistic, there'll be a bit of time for questions and comments. But before I do, let me begin, as always, by thanking IH London for organising this conference and for getting us together, which is always a joy. Right, so let's begin with the breakout room discussion. And here's that quote. We've heard it from many people. I'm choosing Penny Ear's version of it. I think we've all heard this. It has been said that teachers who have been teaching for 20 years may be divided into two categories: those with 20 years experience and those with 1 year's experience repeated 20 times. So the breakout room discussion question is really simple. What is the difference between these two types of teachers in your opinion / experience? Because I don't know which of those two we draw upon. Probably both, and one probably comes from the other. Okay, to begin. Cool. I can see the breakout rooms are still there. Oh, are they not? So, okay, great, cool. I'll just close that one. Great. Okay. So yeah, it's one of those questions which a lot of us kind of intuitively have an opinion about. And most of us will say it's obviously got something to do with learning, the difference between learning from your experience and not. And many of us will also invoke the idea of reflection, sometimes vaguely, sometimes talking about different types of reflection and so on. And I'll come back to that. But the interesting question that I'm going to ask today is whether expertise research can shed useful light onto this question. Expertise research is an unusual body of research which has very high ecological validity because it's carried out in the classrooms of practicing teachers. To date, the vast majority of it has been conducted in the global north, USA in particular, but also in Western Europe. And it's emerging, it's becoming important in China as well. And mine was one of the first studies that looked at teacher expertise in context in the global south, where there's also plenty of expert teachers. But before I move on, let me give an initial definition of expertise. This isn't one that I've adopted in other parts of my research, but it's suitable for today. So for this talk, teacher expertise is understood simply as teacher professional competence. I say simply because it's massively complex as a thing, as a construct, and it's necessarily context specific, and it has to be socio-culturally defined, so no universal definition is possible. But nonetheless, within each context, given that we all recognize the difference, for example, between what are sometimes called experienced non-expert and expert teachers, we do understand some kind of difference there. I mean, we might prefer a different word to expert, but that's an interesting, important, but separate discussion. The recognition here is that some of us with experience seem to achieve higher levels of professional competence than others. Teacher expertise is therefore kind of at the higher end of this competence climb, but it's nothing exclusive. It's something that we can all potentially achieve given the right conditions. And by conditions, I include everything that might mean both the opportunities to develop, the people around us to develop, and the time to develop, which are some of the key variables, factors involved. So it's quite vague as an idea, and I want to keep it vague. I want to keep it as a fuzzy construct that sits there in our minds, as it did for anyone who's ever read the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert Percy. This understanding of, I know that quality exists. It's difficult for me to define even in my context, but it's definitely there. And I want to leave it pretty much sitting in that location. And you'll notice the X and the Y scale here. Those are going to change when I look at some of the expertise research, but I'll come back. But I'd like to begin first of all by talking a little bit about Schoen's reflection in action and the misunderstandings of it typically that occur. A lot of people presume that reflection in action means reflection while teaching, or reflection while doing our practice. It doesn't necessarily. Schoen's reflection in action, if you read Schoen directly, can actually mean for a teacher reflecting between lessons. And Schoen never really contrasted it with reflection on action. That came afterwards. Schoen never hyphenates reflection on action. He always hyphenates reflection in action. And this is because reflection in action is a key part of Schoen's reflective practitioner framework. There's a quote here from Schoen that I think is the most useful one, even though he defines it variously. And he talks about how reflection in action is central to the art through which practitioners cope with the sometimes divergent situations of practice. When the phenomenon at hand eludes the original categories of knowledge in action, presenting itself as unique or unstable. In other words, if any of you were at Richard Chin's talk with Marianne and Alex, they were talking about critical incidents, and many of you will be thinking this sounds like a critical incident, and it very much was what Schoen was talking about. The practitioner may surface, and that word is key to reflection in action, and criticize his initial understanding of the phenomenon, construct a new description of it, a new understanding of it, and test a new description by an on-the-spot experiment. And that is what Schoen, that is, if you like, the crux of why reflection in action is important for Schoen. It means that practitioners in all professional fields, not just teaching, he wasn't even mainly talking about teaching, can develop their own expertise independently of any external input. In other words, it's an opportunity for personal development. And one of the teachers, expert teachers I worked with in India, he talked about introspection, and he described a very, very similar model for how he did this in pretty much isolation from like-minded practitioners. My own research into reflection in action indicates that it definitely exists in the classroom, but probably on-the-spot experimentation might be a little bit too, how can I put it, optimistic. Most of us can't risk doing that, particularly those of us working with primary and secondary learning. And I suggest that the idea of micro-improvisation might be a better construct to understand how we can begin to experiment sometimes in class. If you're interested in that paper, you can drop a message. So there we go. Schoen's reflection in action is a really important construct, if you like, at the end, the critical reflection end of how practitioners may learn through reflection in relation to their practice. Let's look at now another interesting construct and its opposite. Two types of expertise are often discussed in the expertise literature. This is wider than just teachers, all professional kind of expertise. Hatano and Inagaki in 1986 made a distinction between what we call routine expertise, and I'll come on to the second type in a moment, which is a type of kind of efficiency of practice that occurs in somewhat simpler contexts of work. For example, they give the example of an expert gardener. You could think of, say, a checkout assistant as well. Such people learn to perform a skill really fast and really accurately without necessarily constructing or enriching their conceptual knowledge. Routine experts are outstanding in terms of speed, accuracy, and automaticity of performance, but lack flexibility and adaptability to new problems. And the potential alternative that they suggest, and that has been adopted pretty much within the expertise literature, is the idea of adaptive expertise. And by adaptive expertise, this is the quote from Carbonell et al.'s recent paper, but this is basically drawing on the same idea from Hattimer and Innovative. Some people quickly overcome changes in work requirements by inventing new procedures and using their expert knowledge in novel ways, whereas others do not possess this ability and find themselves thrown back performing as a novice. And this, I think, takes us back to the quote that I started with. This is a potential area for understanding that difference. And, you know, in my own readings of it, I would say that adaptive expertise is key to working in highly complex, unstable environments, and has also received support from a large number of empirical studies of expert teachers. I mentioned mine there, but also I could mention probably another 20 or so. So there we go. Adaptive expertise. It's clear that there's a link between that and the reflection and action that I've mentioned before. But I also want to mention a third construct that may be useful. Well, actually two here, but the second of them particularly. Bereiter and Scardamalia talk about reinvestment and progressive problem solving as key to developing expertise. Reinvestment is the, if you like, the affective side of it, and progressive problem solving, the cognitive side of it. Reinvestment is motivational. And it's about the desire of some people to keep investing their cognitive, their critical thinking skills in a specific problem of interest. And with us as teachers, this is going to be a problem of practice, something that we have to understand better. But importantly, not to necessarily waste those resources by simply trying really hard, but to ensure that we retain and conserve some of these resources. There's something to reinvest while we're doing it. But very important to their discussion of expertise is the notion of progressive problem solving. And this is the cognitive aspect of the process of expertise. The effect of progressive problem solving is not only to advance dealing with complexities already known to exist, but also to expand knowledge in ways that bring more complexities to light. And this links to an idea that Donald Schoen talks about, which is problem setting, that experts often actually choose specific problems to deal with. And one interesting part of progressive problem solving is the kind of the metaphor of making sure you don't bite off more than you can digest at a specific point, to gradually understand and deconstruct a problem to be able to solve it or to manage it. And I'll give an example here. Amy Choi's study in Hong Kong with secondary English language teachers, a 2003 book, quite well known in our field. She was heavily influenced by Bereiter and Scardamalia's research. And her expert teacher is a very good example of someone that she argues engages in progressive problem solving. The name of the teacher, the pseudonym used was Marina, and she tended to what Tsui calls problematizing the unproblematic. In other words, she was looking for things to understand better and seeking challenges even when initial problems were solved. And the example I've given here comes from Tsui's book, but there are several others there and many more in the literature. So an example here is in secondary education, the challenge of behavior management issues in the classroom. And she initially solved it by becoming strict. And for many teachers, that may suffice for their dealing with behavior management problems, that old saying of secondary teachers, don't smile till Christmas kind of thing. But then she reinvested because she was interested in resolving the paradox that then resulted, the dichotomy between making learning enjoyable and maintaining discipline in the classroom. And how this particular teacher was able to do that is important. In her research, Amy Tsui contrasts expert teachers not with novice teachers, which is often happening quite a lot in expertise literature, but with what she calls experienced non-experts. And I think within her writing, that would equate to the teacher who's got 1 year's experience repeated. So there we go. 3 interesting constructs, I think, which are useful. And we can also see some evidence from this in the wider expertise literature. In a few weeks' time, I'll have a paper, quite a systematic review paper coming out with Gould and Tanner, a colleague that we worked with together on this. And it's the largest ever systematic review of teacher expertise research ever conducted in education. It will be coming out in Educational Research Review in a few weeks. The pre-pubs are actually available, but don't quote them if you find them. They are actually available online. And among other findings, we find that very importantly, and not surprisingly for everyone in this conference, given what we've been talking about, one of the most important aspects of pedagogic practice that we find is that improvisation and flexibility is the most commonly reported one, both among primary and secondary teachers. We also find that there's clear evidence for expert teachers engaging in progressive experimental problem solving, and that this is only possible through certain cognitive processes, what I've called here automated heuristics, automated processes that relate to teaching and planning. Those things that we can actually do so quickly because we have proceduralized them, such as when you're getting feedback on an activity, such as when at the start of the lesson you're setting things up. Those things that we almost do automatically are really important, freeing up the cognitive resources so that we can deal with the much more complex issues that happen on a moment-by-moment basis as we teach. So to recap on the constructs involved, reflection in action, as I've defined it here, and I'm arguing that kind of the true definition of reflection in action, teacher experiential learning, specifically from unfamiliar challenges, what some people might call critical incidents, presented by complex systems of practice. And Scott, in his first talk, mentioned the murmurations of starlings. I'm a bird watcher. I do a bit of ornithological research. One of the interesting things to contrast here is a starling murmuration can be explained entirely quantitatively by two simple rules that the birds follow. Two rules. When you think about the complexity of teacher practice and the fact that we know that in a single lesson, nearly every teacher would have to make several hundred decisions based each of them on an infinite number of variables, the complexity here is very, very different to that type of complex dynamic system. We're talking about what I would call a super complex dynamic system. So we've got Schoen's reflection in action, we've got progressive problem solving, and we've got adaptive expertise. You may or may not agree with these constructs or idea. They have come fairly strongly from empirical research, but it's always good to be critical about them if you don't like them for some reason. But the next question, which I don't have time to give you time to discuss, unfortunately. So I've got to finish. Let me check. No, we have got time. Let's try it. A few minutes chat. How do these three things interact in your opinion? How do they relate? And let's do a quick breakout room chat.
Yeah, I've opened them.
Great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll have to bring the breakout rooms back together.
Okay.
Thank you. Just because there's quite a few bits to cover still. Let me know when everyone's back, if you can. Thank you.
Yeah, they're coming back in now. Yep.
Great, thank you very much. So it's an interesting question how these relate and interact, whether they're actually talking about the same thing in different ways or approximately the same thing. There's got to be overlap between them, and there's got to be some relationship with these different ways. And you can probably think of other writers whose ideas kind of resonate with these ones as well. Just to give a really simple interpretation, and that it may be much more complex than this, but it seems to me that reflection and action definitely contributes to progressive problem solving, which itself helps to build adaptive expertise. And I'm just going to put that there as one potential relationship. And I wish I could have been there in the room downstairs to listen to some of the ideas, because there may be much more creative relationships. But let me move on and talk about some interesting examples. But before we do, let's actually reflect on that question of what is pathway to expertise. And I've chosen a suitably autumnal picture here to share with you, and then very skeptically put an image of a Buddha in there. Utterly inappropriate, I know. But maybe the pathway to expertise isn't as quiet and as physical, philosophical as that, but maybe it's much more like this. I wanted to find a busy street anywhere, and it turned out that the free image app only gave me one in London. But the pathway to expertise is probably going to be social rather than individual. But in terms of actually looking at how people have conceptualized it, Schwartz et al. Offer this idea of the optimal adaptability corridor. And notice that the two axes here are different to the ones I presented earlier of experience and competence. We've got here efficiency, which does relate to experience, because we know within all the expertise literature and the if we looked at the ACT framework, they all tell us that we develop procedural competence very well over time. But innovation seems to be key and important to developing an adaptability corridor towards expertise. It builds on the work of Hatano and Inagaki. And it's an interesting starting point, but not specific to education. Then Margaret M. Roll at Pepperdine University and her colleague here proposed this alternative, which is based on Schwartz's model. And you can see here that they've got three different directions. The blue one is descriptive path to efficiency expertise, which is essentially the routine expertise of Hatano and Inagaki. Then you've got, interestingly, the vertical one, which I must say, this notion of innovative expertise isn't really empirically founded, but is an idea, an interesting one, I think, a kind of a trial and error version of expertise, but quite volatile. And they argue that the path to adaptive expertise follows the optimal corridor of Schwartz. But they also argue, interestingly, that action research is the means to get to this aim. And that's interesting, because I was just in Claire Steele's talk, and one of the things that she was talking about was the key thing about giving teachers agency, of giving them the participatory options to choose, based on Roger Hart's framework. And it's an interesting fact, of course, that action research does, to some extent, stimulate some of the required skills to develop individually along this pathway to expertise. So there we go. Anyway, so the constructs discussed so far suggest that we need a balance between innovation and efficiency if we're not to either, sorry, I can't see what that says, to burn out or to settle too much, settle down. I was thinking of different options here: settle down, rest on our laurels. I didn't like any of those. I'll just put to settle in our comfort zone, which I think all of us tend to do sometimes. We need opportunities to reflect, particularly critically, on what Schoen calls the divergent situations of practice, often characterized as critical incidents. We need to be encouraged not to avoid problems, and perhaps not to overload on them, but to work on them gradually and systematically. And so the question, which would answer the second kind of part of my talk remit, what kind of CPD activities might support these most effectively? Obviously, Reel and Rowell argue that teacher action research may be one way of doing this. But if I've just got time to maybe hand over for a few minutes, those of you in the room will have a moment to chat to the person next to you again. And let's try it in breakout rooms. Apologies, breakout rooms, if you're not getting enough time. But let's have a quick chat about that. Thank you. Let me know when everyone's back if you can. Thank you.
Sure. I think they're all back in now.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, I did have a moment there just to join one of the great breakout rooms, and interestingly, the discussion in there was very much the discussion about the practicalities of giving teachers opportunities for CPD and the fact that teachers are busy, they're working hard, and the activities that we feel would help to develop the skills required to allow them to develop professional competence expertise isn't necessarily available. And it's something we hear time and time again all around the world. Although there was one of the other members of that group was actually arguing that isn't an excuse. We need to always systematically find that, which I think all of us would agree with here, definitely. So yeah, as I mentioned, obviously, Real and Roll argue that teacher action research offers the path. But the question I always ask myself is, does it suit everyone? And a point I mentioned to Nick in the discussion in the room down there, in room 109, is that I'm interested in the fact that whilst I really strongly believe in action research, I feel that it suits some teachers really well, and other teachers it doesn't suit very well, and some teachers it doesn't suit at all. And another way of looking at it is that I've seen people who are incredible teachers who are rubbish at doing action research. No disrespect to them, but it's not for them. And there's people who are really good at doing action research, but who actually can't teach to save their lives. And so the fact that the two don't, in other words, you can have one without the other, tells us that it's not necessarily, that's the only potential path toward expertise. And I think anybody here in this conference with the experience that we've got here will know that what we actually need is a kind of a differentiated pathway towards expertise. And I've gone back to my old simplistic a diagram here of experience, because we know expertise requires a degree of experience to develop, and competence. And I would suggest that we've got lots of things that could contribute to this. Yes, action research is definitely one of them, and it definitely works for some of the teachers I know. Reflective practice is another one. Several colleagues, Claire, I think, was mentioning Steve Mann and Walsh's work there on this, and also Dewey's as well. Community of practice participation, and it was interesting being in Marianne Richards and Alex's talk, where they were talking about their critical friends group. Also, Claire talked about critical friends group, but the person there was kind of somewhat more less complimentary. There were positive and negatives to that. But in Richard, Marianne and Alex's group, this was discussed as being a really important part of what they'd found useful in the group set up here at IH London. We've also got things like exploratory practice, originally developed by Dick Allwright, continued by Judith Hanks as a potential way of doing this. And then we can also look at different models of collaborative inquiry, and there's many of these. But the important thing about collaborative inquiry is that it requires the support of our peers to develop. And a good example of this, a simple example of this, would be lesson plan. Although lesson plan, interestingly, is becoming very diverse things around the world as we look at different ways it's realized in different contexts, arguably as it should always develop and adapt to contextual situations. So how am I doing for time? About 10 minutes left, great. Yeah, so another source of evidence from expertise research might be useful here. As part of the meta review that we did on teacher expertise studies, we looked at what they were saying about the professionalism of expert teachers. In other words, what professional activities do they engage in? Now, these aren't necessarily the activities they engaged in order to become expert teachers, but it's useful at least to look at what they are doing or what seems to be important to them. And out of 18 themes that emerged from the research data, the top 10 themes that reached what we called an agreement count, in other words, our independent coding of the data suggests that all of these themes came up at least 5 times, in fact 6 times, the ones you can see. And interestingly, at the top of this was the fact that they reflect extensively. And you can see the 2 columns. The second column, pri rank, refers to primary rank, and sec rank, secondary. So both in primary and secondary education, it's clear that extensive reflection is important. And if anybody ever needed evidence why reflection is important, you can cite this paper. Have a look a bit further down the list. Reflects critically also comes through frequently. And by critically, we included things like self-questioning, problematizing one's own practice. In other words, whenever one was asking questions, that notion of reflexivity that Julie and Edge puts forward very nicely is really important there. But also interesting to look throughout the list here. We've got things like continuous lifelong learning. I don't think any of us will be surprised by that. But notice how many social activities are here. They're helping teachers a lot. They're helping their colleagues, including mentoring, informal peer support. They're leaders in their school. They're interested in sharing resources with their colleagues. In other words, they're not hoarders, they're sharers. And their collaboration, they're members of professional learning communities, communities of practice, and so on. Also interesting is that they do engage in normal forms of what we might call inset, normal forms of kind of going to workshops, training. These seem to also be important for them. And interestingly, progressive problem solving did actually make it onto this list, but that may be biased to some extent by its prominence in the literature. In other words, researchers, because this is quite a commonly discussed theme, may be looking for it in their studies. And anyway, an interesting further source of evidence that may suggest how experts develop. So, to summarize all of this, the research seems to suggest that for teachers to gain and maintain expertise, they need opportunities to reflect extensively and critically on their practice. They need appropriate challenges to experiment, take risks, engage in progressive problem solving, and move beyond their comfort zone. They need frequent and varied opportunities for CPD. One path doesn't fit all, according to my experience and according to this research, particularly through collaboration with colleagues in professional learning communities, communities of practice, etc. And they need interaction with expert teachers. In other words, those of us developing expertise ideally need context where we can interact with what I've called expert teachers through things like mentoring, peer support, and guidance. Now, I bet for many of the people in the room, there'll be a little bit of disappointment that kind of, I knew all of that. But it's useful to have research evidence that does validate that if you knew all of this. And if you didn't, there may be some interesting new stuff to take away. But the key point here is that expertise research can provide this kind of evidence because it doesn't conduct experimental research, which is often at low levels of ecological efficiency. It doesn't conduct research which doesn't necessarily apply in the classroom, for example, laboratory research. It's research on real teachers and what they're doing in real classrooms in their real careers. In other words, it's manageable, it's doable for them. And the question about whether it's doable for the rest of us is a fascinating one, but arguably so if we want to develop expertise and if we want to support the colleagues we're working with to develop it. You get the idea. Anyway, there we go. So I think that is my last slide. Yes, and here's the references. Here's the references for that talk, and we may have time to open up questions. If we can. You'll see in the references here, the first one is the research I did on reflection in action, published in Teaching and Teacher Education. The second one is my PhD study in India, if you're interested. That's available on Warwick Wrap. And the third one is the meta summary, which if you can wait a few weeks before downloading it, because it's still in the pre-proof stages, there's a few corrections that need to happen. And then the rest of them there are available. If you can't get any of these papers, just drop me a message, I can send them through. You can see my email at the bottom there, my own personal website and my Warwick website. Thank you. Questions?
Thank you very much. That was amazing. A lot to digest for me personally. Yes, there's a question in the chat box, and maybe also we could open up the in room 109. I think there are some questions maybe from the floor there as well.
I can't see any questions in the chat. Oh, wait, we got Sophie. Yeah, Sophie, questions about classroom routines. It's a really interesting one. The expertise research indicates that expert teachers, particularly at primary levels, have very specific classroom routines that the learners know. But the heuristics themselves are much more to do with the internal cognitive processes that we engage with as teachers. You know, when your brain goes into auto mode and you're kind of able to do something without actually thinking about it. Richard and colleagues mentioned it in their talk. That's what these heuristics are. And because you're able to do some things automatically, you know, like you can't actually, if you're like me, I can't actually multitask until I get into a classroom. And then all of a sudden I'm clicking on the computer, writing on the board and trying to sensitively correct a learner error. That's because of the heuristics we've developed as teachers, that autopilot mode that enables us to free up resources. But classroom routines definitely a part, very important for expert primary teachers. Have a look at Borko, B-O-R-K-O's research, Borko and Livingston on that. But primary context, secondary less so interesting. Any questions in the room?
Yes. If you stop sharing your screen for a second,
yeah,
maybe we can then get the.
Good idea.
And then hand over to Fenella.
2 minutes, I think.
Hold on 1 sec. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi,
yeah.
David. I have a little question around what's your understanding of, or what does it mean to reflect extensively?
Well, I suppose when we were coding here, we were looking at evidence in the papers that, at least remember, you're coding when you're doing a meta summary or a meta review, you're coding other people's research. So we were looking in the findings of expertise studies that indicated that there was evidence that the expert teachers involved were reflecting more than the so-called non-expert. And so in that sense, it's a very vague idea. That was part of the coding framework. So I'm not going to say anything more about that per se from my own experience. That would just be my opinion. But that's what we meant by that use of that phrase, that expert teachers seem to reflect more than non-expert.
Okay, thank you. Nick?
No. Is reflecting more a feature of your knowledge, so you've got more knowledge to bear, right? Or is it a psychological thing that you are reflecting more, you're putting more effort in?
I know. It's a really interesting question. It's what's your opinion, Nick?
I think probably the first one is you've got more knowledge to bring into, so more questions to ask while you're reflecting.
Yeah, but it's interesting if we teach on like a self-term, I never see that there's a deficit of reflection there. Do you know what I mean by that? That we've definitely all got a whole load of knowledge. There's interesting facts that we learn the majority of what we know by the time we're 5 years old. There's still lots there to reflect on, and we've all, from the so-called apprenticeship of observation, we've all had opportunities to be in classrooms for a long time. But yeah, no, my feeling is that that's true, Nick. Yeah, but I definitely wouldn't be able to comment on that from the point of view of the research. It's just a really interesting question. The paper on reflection in action indicates that quite strongly that the teachers involved, that there were different types of reflection, different levels at which the reflections seem to be meaningful and seem to be longer lasting. And that offers support to this idea of surfacing, that you need some kind of critical incident, some difficult moments where something becomes important and it stays with you, it sticks because of the importance of that moment, something we've all experienced, I think.
Thank you. I wonder, there was one more question in the chat, which slightly further up, it was a little bit earlier from Ben Rampton about, Ben, can you see it? That's kind of a long one about.
Yeah, where is it? Read it out for me, I can't see it.
It says, where do notions like natural talent fit into this discussion? What's the place of people who leave teaching after 5 years? Both were important ideas in the UK's Teach First programme. Is there a bias towards long-term career professionals? And if there is it missing something important?
Oh, I'd love to hear what Ben wants to say about that. Is he in the room?
He should be, Ben.
Ben, can you shout out there? I've seen him there. Jessica, can you? It's not Jessica, is it?
Do you want to unmute, Ben, and talk?
Do leave teaching after 5 years, and are they being factored out of this discussion when actually they're quite an important group of people?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. I know you know the point there. That in the UK, we're seeing this time and time again. In America, it's very evident that many teachers are being pushed out early on in their careers. And one of the interesting things about expertise research is that, independent of field, the evidence is quite strong that we need at least 5 years. Some authors would say 7 years before expertise is developing. And some people, in fact, in my own review for a different book I'm writing, you have to make a cutoff point, and it seems to be very clear that at least 5 years of full-time teaching are necessary before somebody can reach a level of professional competence with the amount of professional pedagogical content knowledge, with the amount of automated heuristics that are required for expertise. If somebody's disappearing from a career before 5 years, it's very unlikely they'll get there. But there is that interesting thing, if you remember the real and role chart, but they talk about innovative expertise, and we all know those individuals. Somehow they don't seem to have anywhere near enough experience, but they can still teach really well, at least according to our own personal ideas of what teaching is. And we envy them intensively, and we don't understand how they do it. But there's definitely those individuals as well. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. We'll have to stop there, but that was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Thank you for coming.